8 a.m. The sunlight had just broken through the old moss-draped trees of Charleston, casting a pale golden glow across the stately facade of the federal courthouse. The door of a Buick swung open. Laura stepped out, her posture upright, her face bare of makeup, but her gaze sharper than any law ever written. She wasn't wearing her judge's robe. She didn't need to. Laura never relied on titles to demand respect. She entered the courthouse as a citizen, but carried the weight of justice within her, and that alone was unbearable for those who were used to wielding power behind uniforms. Main security checkpoint. The gaze of the guard on duty, Danny paused on her, not because he recognized her, but because he didn't. And in his world, a black woman couldn't possibly be someone. To Danny, Laura was a stranger who looked far too confident. "Stop." His voice was gruff, commanding. "Step out of line." Laura furrowed her brow. "I have a federal badge." She presented her ID. The metallic seal of the United States government gleamed under the ceiling lights. But Danny didn't bother to inspect it. He took the badge, glanced at it, and then slipped it into his pocket. "My ID," Laura said, her tone calm. "I need it." He smirked and stepped in closer, his breath thick with cheap coffee. "In a hurry, sweetheart?" And with that, like ice water thrown in her face, her dignity was slapped. It wasn't just a personal insult. It was how an entire system had grown, used to treating people like her, with contempt, condescension, and suppression, even when they wore the law on their shoulders. Before she could respond, she was yanked out of the line and shoved into a private screening room. No windows, cameras, or witnesses. "You're acting suspicious," Danny said. "Sit down." Laura remained standing. "I do not consent. No warrant, no cause. You have no right." "We have a reason," Danny growled as two other officers entered. One seized her left arm. The other moved in behind. Then Danny picked up the clippers. "Your hair's a mess," he sneered. "Might be hiding something in there." And he began to cut. The buzzing of the blade rang out like the sound of justice being shaved bare, of dignity being scraped against cold stone. Strands of silver hair, each a thread of memory, legacy, and pride, fell silently to the floor. No one stopped. No one spoke. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, memorizing every second. Because what was rising inside her wasn't shame. It was fire. And very soon Danny, and the system that had protected him for years, would realize they shaved the wrong woman. She wasn't there to attend court. She was the court. She was Judge Laura. And today, justice wouldn't whisper. It would roar. The hallway leading to the main courtroom was long and empty. Laura's footsteps echoed like war drums, not fast, not slow, but firm. Her hair was now patchy and uneven, and silver tufts fell behind her, like slashes against her dignity. But she didn't bow her head. No hat, no scarf to cover it. She let the humiliation show, like a declaration. She walked past two clerks. They saw her. They realized what had happened, and they turned away. No one spoke. No one stopped Danny. They were afraid, or they were used to it. The noise from inside the courtroom spilt to the door. Today was a hearing for a case involving police brutality during a protest, a big one. Journalists, lawyers, and even victims' families were present. The name of the case was the media's focus. But in just a few seconds, all of that would be overshadowed by another name: Laura. She was supposed to come in the back through the private lounge. She was supposed to have someone help her put on her robe. But no. She pushed open the heavy double doors, letting them swing wide into a room filled with chatter. And immediately the courtroom fell silent. A few heads turned. Then all heads turned. Confused eyes, whispers. "What's going on? Who is that? Oh my God, her hair." She walked straight down the aisle, step by step, Between the benches, attorneys stood up. Cameras began to lift, but no one said a word because they realized. The woman who had been dragged like a criminal that morning. The one pulled into a screening room without cause. The one whose hair had been cut like an unspoken punishment. The one Danny had dismissed. She was the judge. She was the one about to take the bench. Laura ascended the platform. The black robe was neatly folded on the chair. No one helped her with it. She did it herself. Every movement is slow and deliberate, like donning armor forged from truth, from anger, being shaped into justice. She lifted her head and looked at the court clerk. "Is the witness list ready?" The clerk's voice trembled but answered, Yes, Your Honor." Laura gave a slight nod. Then she sat, in the judge's chair. At the corner of the room, Danny, the man who just 3 hours earlier had dragged her like a criminal, was now frozen by the door. His face went pale, lips parted, eyes locked in disbelief. He had thought she was crushed, but no, she had returned, above him. And Laura didn't look at him. Not yet. She didn't need to. She looked straight ahead, voice cold as steel. "This court is now in session. Case number 2371F, United States versus the Charleston Police Department. Charges: abuse of authority, excessive force, and violation of civil rights." No one dared to breathe too loudly, because they had just witnessed a storm ascend the throne. The first two witnesses were called to the stand, one after another. Both had participated in last year's peaceful protest. One was a veteran who had been shoved to the ground and suffered broken ribs. The other, a student who had been choked unconscious. Laura sat quietly, taking notes and asking no questions. She didn't need to. She was waiting for the right person. And then, after the second testimony, just as the clerk was about to announce a recess, Laura spoke, her voice like a sharpened blade slicing through the air. "Deputy Danny, step forward and stand in the center of the courtroom." Danny flinched. He had been standing near the door, hoping to slip out unnoticed in the crowd. But no. All eyes turned to him. A few people rose to their feet. The two officers posted by the exits straightened. He strolled, face pale, like a grown-up walking the executioner's path. "State your full name, position, and years of service," Laura said, expressionless. "Danny Carson, Deputy Bailiff, 14 years. She nodded, tapping her pen lightly against the bench. Once, twice. Then she looked directly into his eyes. "In your 14 years of service, how many times have you escorted women into the private screening room?" Danny swallowed. "I don't recall exactly." "I do. There are 12 formal complaints. At least 5 women testified that they were inappropriately touched, humiliated, and silenced, forced to leave. You know what they all had in common? They were all black women." Danny tried to speak, but Laura gave him no chance. "Who did you think I was this morning?" she asked, voice low but piercing. I didn't know." "Exactly. You didn't know. Because you didn't need to know. You saw a black woman in a blazer, no robe, no security, no entourage, and you saw someone you could shove into a room and no one would care." The courtroom was deathly still. Laura stood up, removed the pen from her hand, and looked straight at Danny, not as a man, but as a living embodiment of a broken system. "You cut my hair, not for security, not because of protocol, but because you wanted to remind me I don't belong here." Her voice turned to steel. "But today, I don't sit here merely as a judge. I sit here as a warning." She nodded toward the 2 officers standing guard. "Detain Deputy Danny Carson. Do not hold him with other defendants. I'm ordering solitary holding. For this is not just an employee who broke rules. This is living evidence of rot within the system." Danny shouted, "You're just getting revenge. I didn't know who you were." Laura looked at him. No shouting was needed. "And that is the problem." The two officers stepped forward and handcuffed Danny in front of the entire courtroom. As he was led away, no one spoke. No one turned away. No one intervened. Because justice, for the first time, had stepped down from the bench and called it by name. After Danny was escorted out of the courtroom, the atmosphere in the courthouse had yet to settle. Some people were still in shock. Others exchanged glances, as if they had just witnessed a historic moment. But for Judge Laura, the battle had only just begun. She turned to the clerk. "Notify the entire prosecution team, representatives from the Department of Justice and Internal Affairs. I want a closed-door meeting within 30 minutes. And call security. I want every surveillance video from this morning backed up immediately." The clerk nodded, hands trembling, but her eyes were clearer than ever. She stood before a woman who would not back down. In her private office, Laura sat silently, staring at the mirror before her. The section of hair that had been shaved that morning. A wound that didn't bleed but burned. Then came a knock. She turned. A tall man entered. Silver hair cropped short, a firm face. Marcus Grant, a federal agent from the Office for the Protection of Justice. "Judge Laura," he said in a deep voice, "we've received the video from the security cameras and the full recording from the screening room this morning. Everything is clear." "Good," Laura replied, emotionless. "I don't need pity. I need the truth exposed." Grant nodded, then pulled a file from his briefcase. He placed it in front of her. "You need to see this." Inside the file were 12 formal complaints, all named Deputy Danny Carson. The statements detailed harassment, psychological abuse, and abuse of power, particularly targeting Black women and the vulnerable. But what stood out most was that every single complaint had been dismissed by one man. Judge Terrence Halford, Laura's predecessor, the man who once mentored her into the federal judiciary. Laura clenched the file. "He knew everything," she said quietly. "He didn't just ignore it. He protected Danny." "Not just him," Grant added. "At least 3 federal prosecutors, 2 heads of security departments, and 1 appellate judge were involved in rejecting complaints, erasing records, or altering incident reports. They built a system to protect each other, and Danny was just the surface." Laura leaned back in her chair. "We're not investigating a man. We're tearing open a network." At that moment, the clerk stepped in and whispered, "There's someone outside who wants to submit a voluntary testimony." "Who?" Laura asked. "Denise Talley, former records office staff," she said. "I've been silent for too long, but today I don't want to walk out of this building without telling the truth." Laura stood. Her judge's robe still hung on the rack, but she didn't put it on, because today she didn't need that robe to make people listen. Denise Talley, a former records clerk of the courthouse, entered the courtroom with a quiet demeanor, short hair, an old but pressed suit, clutching a thick stack of papers in her arms. Laura looked at her. They had worked together since the early days. A dedicated woman, always on time, always quiet, and also the one who had witnessed it all. The prosecuting attorney stood. "Ms. Talley, please state what your role was at the Charleston Federal Courthouse." "I was a records clerk for 11 years, responsible for handling internal complaints, reviewing claims, and forwarding case files to the assigned judge." She paused, looking at Laura. "I used to believe in this system. Did you ever process complaints involving Mr. Danny Carson?" Denise nodded, then took a deep breath. "I processed at least 12 official complaints. All were from individuals who had suffered abuses of power by Danny, female attorneys, court clerks, even regular civilians." "What did you do with those complaints?" Denise looked down. "I submitted them, per protocol, but nearly all were returned with remarks like, 'insufficient evidence,' 'resolved internally,' or 'the complainant failed to cooperate. And the person who signed off on those was Judge Terrence Halford. The courtroom fell silent. A few murmured. Several reporters began typing rapidly on their keyboards. Laura remained still, but her gaze was sharp as a blade. "Did you ever speak to anyone directly about this?" "I once asked Judge Halford about it, after an intern reported being inappropriately touched by Danny." "What did he say?" Denise raised her head, voice trembling. "He said, she should know it's better to stay silent, and you, if you want to keep your job, same goes for you." The prosecutor stepped aside. Judge Laura looked at Denise, then stood. "Ms. Talley," her voice calm but resonant, "you just broke what dozens of others were afraid to, the silence. And in doing so, you've unlocked an entire door." Denise lowered her head slightly, eyes brimming. "I'm sorry I didn't do this sooner." Laura nodded solemnly. "Today is not the day for apologies. Today is the day for standing up. And you did that." As Denise stepped down from the stand, the eyes in the courtroom began to shift. Some lifted their heads timidly. Some glanced around, guilt flickering in their eyes. But Laura knew. The first lock had been broken, and once one breaks, the others are only a matter of time. As Denise stepped down from the witness stand, the air in the courtroom felt as heavy as lead. But something had changed. It was no longer fear, no longer silence, but the foreboding sense that a flood was coming. The prosecutor approached Judge Laura and handed her a new folder. "Your Honor, we've just received a request to testify from a voluntary witness. He wasn't on the original list, but under the Witness Protection Act, we recommend allowing it." Laura nodded. "Call him." The side door opened. An older man with a salt and pepper beard, a slight limp, and wearing an old U.S. Marshal's uniform, stepped in. The entire room held its breath. "Please state your name and former position." "My name is Andrew Taylor. I was a federal marshal stationed in Charleston from 2003 to 2013. "Do you know the defendant, Danny Carson?" "I do. Very well." The courtroom fell silent again. Taylor began to speak slowly. "I worked in the same courthouse as him for over 10 years. What I witnessed sometimes made me wonder whether I was protecting justice or merely upholding a rotten system." He spoke of illegal searches Danny conducted on young black individuals, multiple instances where Danny verbally abused and physically touched women in the security zone, without any disciplinary action, and a report he had submitted to his superiors in 2010, accusing Danny of assaulting a young defendant, a report that later vanished, without explanation. At the time, I stayed silent. I chose to walk away. But now I understand. Silence is complicity. Laura sat still, but in her heart, every word from Mr. Taylor struck like a blade carving through the wall of lies that this courthouse had built for decades. Her voice was calm, yet precise like a scalpel. "Mr. Taylor, are you willing to provide copies of any remaining records you may still have?" I brought them with me. He placed a small USB drive on the witness stand. In here are handwritten notes, old faxes, and even an internal response letter from 2010. Never opened. I kept them, because I knew a day would come when they'd be needed. Laura nodded, her gaze now burning like fire in the cold night. And that day is today. The entire courtroom froze. A few attorneys' hands trembled. Reporters scribbled furiously. Spectators whispered beneath their breath. And Danny Carson, sitting in the defendant's box, lowered his head. No more arrogance, no more smug grin, only fear. Laura declared, "This court will recess for 30 minutes, but let this be absolutely clear. When we return, this will no longer be the trial of one man. It will be the judgment of an entire system that protected him for over a decade." As the trial resumed, it was no longer an ordinary courtroom. It had become a grand stage where masks began to fall. The prosecutors submitted copies of the data from Andrew Taylor's USB. Inside were: evidence shows that the Internal Affairs Office had buried 12 official complaints, internal emails containing racist language, a fax from 2011 bearing a signed statement, case dismissed due to insufficient grounds, but with a handwritten note: if this one gets out, the press will tear this department apart. Judge Laura could no longer hide her fury. She sat upright, her gaze drilling deep into the defense table. Is anyone here still wanting to argue that this was just an isolated incident? No one answered. At that moment, an older attorney, representing the Department of Justice, stood up, his face tense. Your Honor, I've been authorized to inform the court that A.D. Frank Delaney wishes to testify and make a voluntary confession. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The door opened. A man in a gray suit with silver hair stepped in. It was Frank, the same man who had handled dozens of cases involving Danny Carson. Frank stood before the court, hand on the Bible. His voice was hoarse, but steady. I am the one who declined to prosecute many of the cases involving Danny Carson. I did not do it due to lack of evidence. I was under pressure, from superiors, from judges, from someone I once believed was a mentor. Laura tilted her head slightly, her voice cold as steel. The name of that person? Frank hesitated, then spoke. Judge Terrence Mahoney. A wave of shock swept through the courtroom. Some gasped. Several journalists immediately pulled out their phones. Terrence Mahoney, the former chief judge of Charleston, and the person who once sponsored Laura into the judicial system. Laura showed no emotion. She said, "Enter that into the official record." Frank continued his confession. I once heard him say, "Order is more important than truth," and I obeyed. But when I saw Laura walk into the courtroom, her head shaved, still presiding, I knew I could no longer stay silent. The entire room stood still, not out of fear, but out of respect. Laura looked at him, then turned to the prosecutor. Record the testimony. And I hereby request that the district attorney's office launch a formal investigation into every case signed by Mr. Delaney and Judge Mahoney. Just as she finished speaking, a man stood at the back of the room. His face had remained unremarkable among the gallery since morning. I also have a testimony to offer. Some recognized him. Reverend Marcus Hill, a minister who had led many protests in Charleston. He stepped up to the witness stand and was sworn in. I'm not here as a named witness in any file. I'm here as a survivor, unlawfully detained, beaten, falsely charged, and silenced for over 20 years. He raised a worn, yellowing folder with torn edges. I submitted this complaint to this courthouse in 2002. It was returned. No explanation. Laura looked at him intently. Are you willing to submit that file to the federal investigation? Not only that, I've made complete copies, and there are 17 others. They're waiting in the hallway, ready to testify. The room erupted, not in outrage, but in hope. After years of silence, someone finally dared to open the door, and that someone was a black woman, once forcibly shaved, now sitting on the bench, leading an unprecedented reckoning. Laura struck the gavel. I declare, this court will reconvene tomorrow morning, and we will not only try Danny Carson, we will uncover the entire system that enabled him. The front lawn was packed the next morning before the courthouse doors opened. National news outlets had cameras set up on every step. Civil rights activists held signs reading, "Protect Black Women, Punish Abuse." On social media, the hashtag number sign Judge Laura was trending across all platforms. One photo went viral. Laura in her judge's robe, the shaved side of her head still visible, her eyes cold as steel, and behind her, a long line of people raising their hands to testify. Inside, Laura sat at her desk in the chambers. Before her were 3 thick files with familiar names underlined in red. ADA Frank Delaney, already confessed. Police Chief Ron Ellis had received complaints, but never acted. Judge Mahoney, her former mentor, who had buried dozens of allegations. On the table, a fresh fax had just arrived. Senate Judiciary Committee requests testimony from Judge Laura regarding supervisory failures in the judiciary. She folded the paper. Supervisory failure? No, I call it systemic complicity. At exactly 9 a.m., the court reconvened. The courtroom was packed, and this time, it wasn't just the public. A special row in the back held 3 sitting U.S. senators, a representative from the U.S. Department of Justice, and quietly seated in the far left corner was Mahoney, silver-haired, gripping a cane, his eyes heavy with silence. Laura entered. She wasn't wearing her robe. She wore a black suit. Her shaved head was fully exposed. Her gaze met everyone's. Unflinching. There was no grand declaration, just a heavy silence. Then she spoke. Before we continue, I have an announcement. She raised a red-covered document. This is a reform petition filed under my name, the Laura Mandate. Whispers filled the courtroom. It includes a full review of all complaints buried over the past 15 years, reinvestigation of every case handled by ADA Frank Delaney and Judge Mahoney involving law enforcement, a ban on federal security staff conducting personal searches without clear legal justification, and most importantly, the formation of an independent oversight committee for judicial conduct elected by the people. The defense attorney sprang to his feet. Your Honor, this is a courtroom, not a political stage. Laura turned, her voice calm, but slicing through the air like a blade. It's because you treat courtrooms like fortresses of power that I must turn them into forums of truth. She looked directly into the TV cameras. If you fear I'm no longer impartial after being humiliated, then watch this. She opened another file, a list of 12 new witnesses. All were victims of Danny Carson and others like him. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to end an era of silence. At that moment, a reporter stood, hand raised. Judge Laura, are you preparing to go to war against the system? She stared into the lens, unblinking. No. I'm not stepping onto a battlefield. I'm standing on the ashes of a system that thought it was untouchable, and I'm the one laying the first brick of what will replace it. And this was only the beginning. After the historic announcement of the Laura Mandate, the court was adjourned for a 15-minute recess. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed with whispers, but Laura remained at the bench. She stood there, eyes fixed on the corner of the room where former Judge Terrence Mahoney sat, a dark corner. The light didn't reach him. But Laura saw clearly. The man who once brought her into the profession. The man who once called her the first black beacon of hope for the federal court. And the man who signed off on dismissing 12 complaints against Danny Carson. Mahoney slowly stepped into the courtroom's center, his cane tapping against the stone floor with dry, echoing clicks. Judge Monroe, he said without a microphone, may we speak privately? Laura didn't respond. She nodded slightly, signaling the guards to close the main doors, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I once believed you were the future of this system, Mahoney began. But now I see you're not its future. You're a threat to everything we've preserved. Laura stepped down from the bench. Each step lands like a strike against stone. You weren't preserving the law. You were preserving privilege and trading justice for silence. Mahoney gripped his cane tightly. You think you're winning? This system has outlived generations. People like me, we know how to manage chaos. You just inflame it. Laura moved closer, now face to face. No, you masked evil in the name of stability. I'm not stirring up chaos. I'm just peeling the mask off it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mahoney lowered his voice. "You won't win. You're bringing the whole system down to prove that you're not weak." Laura replied, her voice lower still. "I don't need to prove anything. I just need you to face what you buried." Just as she finished speaking, the rear doors opened. A representative from the Department of Justice stepped in, accompanied by a federal internal affairs investigator. "Judge Mahoney," the DOJ representative declared, "you are hereby summoned for an emergency federal hearing under allegations of suppressing serious complaints, misconduct in office, and abetting civil rights violations." Mahoney sneered. "You really think you can bring me down with a few old files?" Laura stepped forward. "No, Mahoney. I don't need to bring you down. You dug your own grave 15 years ago. I'm simply turning on the light so everyone can see it." Mahoney was escorted out, but he did not lower his head, and Laura didn't watch him go, because she knew this was just one layer of darkness peeled back. Behind her, a Washington Post reporter whispered, "She's no longer just a judge. She's becoming a seismic shift." And this was only step 2, because after Mahoney, there was still a long list of those who thought they'd never be touched. 3 days after the Mahoney hearing, the city of Charleston was no longer quiet. The media swarmed outside the federal courthouse. National outlets raced to publish headlines like, "The humiliated black judge who exposed the entire system." Over 17 abuse case files reopened. A new chapter of justice began with a head of hair cut off. At the Department of Justice, a list of 28 names was printed and marked urgent. 6 officers previously accused but exonerated. 5 prosecutors, including one currently running for state attorney general. 3 senior judges, who had shared the council bench with Laura just last year. And one at the top, Senator Francis Lyle, South Carolina's top legislative advisor. That evening, Laura sat in her office, desk lamp casting shadows across the files. Beside her were 3 people. Carter, her closest confidant, silently ensured her safety. Denise Talley, once a witness, now a trusted ally. And Megan, the young intern, now helping to comb through case files suspected of manipulation. On the desk lay a long list of case summaries: dismissed due to procedural error, closed due to lack of corroboration, defendant accepted plea bargain without counsel. Each line represented a person once crushed by the system. Carter looked at Laura. "They're shifting. Some on the list are starting to back out. I heard A.D. Nelson has resigned. Judge Granger filed for early retirement. And Lyle, he's flying back from D.C. in a hurry." Laura didn't smile. She spoke in a low, firm voice. "That's not collapse. That's escape. I want the truth, not guilt-driven disappearances." At that moment, the desk phone rang. An unknown number. She picked up. "Judge Monroe," a male voice, old and powerful. "We need to talk." "Who is this?" Laura asked. "I'm the man who helped Francis Lyle into the Senate." "And what do you want?" "For you to stop. Drop the list. Can't you see? The system is bleeding, and if you keep cutting, the next one on the table will be you." Laura was silent for a moment, then replied, quietly but sharp as a blade, "Good. Because right now, my blood isn't bleeding. It's boiling. I'm not dissecting the system. I'm the one who opened the operating room and turned the lights on. If you can't handle that light, then get out of the room." She hung up, leaned back in her chair, not tired, just sharper. The next day, a leaked recording from within the DOJ surfaced. In the recording, Senator Lyle, back in 2019, could be heard saying at a private event, "These young black kids, letting guys like Carson or Riker teach them a lesson, is right. And those black judges like Monroe? Give them one hard blow. They'll shut up." The entire city exploded. Twitter. #Laura Mandate trended nationally. CNN reported, Charleston court investigation expands statewide. One journalist called it the most significant legal earthquake in the American South since the Civil Rights Movement. But while the media roared, Laura knew the winds hadn't calmed, because Lyle had yet to appear. And the most powerful players, they rarely step into the light until the final hour, 7 p.m., one day after the leaked audio. Charleston was still swept in a wave of outrage. In Judge Monroe's office, dim light spilled across Laura's steady face. She was rereading the list of 28 individuals involved in evidence suppression, case manipulation, and the silencing of honest law enforcers. One name sat at the bottom of the list. Not bolded, not underlined, but more striking than all the rest. Francis Lyle, federal senator, Judicial Security Advisor of South Carolina. Carter entered, carrying a thick file folded neatly. He placed it in front of Laura. This is the rest. Evidence of illicit contributions, encrypted email exchanges, and internal directives. They built an entire system to protect people like Danny and Mahoney. And Francis Lyle was the one pulling the strings from behind the curtain. Laura flipped through each page. Her gaze no longer held anger. It was sharp as forged steel. 9 a.m. the next day. The federal courthouse conference room was packed with reporters, federal agents, DOJ officials, and members of the state legislature. Laura didn't wear her judicial robe. She stepped up to the microphone, holding a 62-page internal indictment. Today is not a trial. This is a truth hearing for those who thought they stood above the law. She looked directly at the center row, where Francis Lyle had just entered. Calm, gray suit, sunglasses, flanked by 2 bodyguards. Laura opened the first page. This man was once hailed as a protector of stability, but for the past 12 years, he hasn't protected the system. He has muzzled it. Mr. Lyle directed ADA offices not to prosecute Danny Riker when complaints arose. He used his influence in the Senate to block transparency bills from being voted on. And he approved the secret budget for the Internal Protection Fund, where dozens of cases were buried. Lyle stood, smirking. Judge Monroe, I believe you've forgotten who you're speaking to. Laura stepped away from the mic, approaching him, unblinking. No, Mr. Lyle. I remember perfectly. I'm speaking to the last statue in a rotten temple, and I'm here to tear you off the pedestal. She turned to the DOJ representative and handed over the file. I request a formal federal investigation into Mr. Francis Lyle on the following charges: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, harboring organized misconduct, and complicity in systematic civil rights violations. Silence fell over the room. Then a reporter stood, raising a hand. Are you afraid, Judge Monroe? They've threatened you, your family. If you keep going, you could lose everything. Laura looked straight into the camera lens. I had my hair cut off in a locked room. I was humiliated before I ever sat on the bench, and I still sat. So today, I don't stand here to ask for justice. I stand here to take it back. At the close of the hearing, the room erupted. Lyle said nothing, gripped his briefcase, and walked out. But this time, no bodyguard opened the door for him, because someone from the FBI was already waiting outside. That night, in her office, Carter entered with a breaking news bulletin. CNN confirms Senator Francis Lyle has been suspended from office and summoned for questioning at the federal headquarters. The DOJ launches a statewide federal investigation. Laura set her pen down. No celebration, no relief. She whispered one sentence. They thought this was the final move, but I know. I've only just placed the first pawn, 3 months later. Charleston entered a winter no colder than usual, but hearts felt different. The federal courthouse, once a fortress of silence, was now filled with very different sounds. Footsteps of law students coming to learn. The recorded voices of victims are archived, and daily news of reforms in motion. At a formal press conference, The Department of Justice officially announced Senator Francis Lyle was indicted on 5 federal charges. Danny Riker was sentenced to 12 years in prison. 4 judges and 3 prosecutors were suspended, and 2 were criminally charged. The Monroe Mandate was adopted as mandatory policy across the entire federal court system in the Southern District. That day, Laura Monroe stood before the same old wooden podium where she was once humiliated. No wig, no longer hiding behind court decisions, only truth and a promise. She reached out and touched the judge's bench one last time. I'm not leaving because I'm tired. I'm leaving because I know. My mission no longer sits in this chair. Justice doesn't begin with a verdict. It begins when someone dares to stand while the entire room keeps its head down. And today, I want the next generation to know it's possible. Laura resigned with honor, but she did not disappear. 2 weeks later, at a university law auditorium, over 300 students sat in complete silence, listening to the woman who had once been humiliated in a security room, who had exposed an entire system, who had made a nation listen. If you're the first to ask why, you'll be disliked. If you're the only one to stand, you'll be isolated. But if you keep walking forward, you'll be the reason others dare to stand too. A young woman stood up, her eyes brimming with tears. You made me believe that a black woman could not only be heard, but trusted. Laura smiled. You don't need to be like me. You need to be nothing like them. The following month, a new bill was proposed in Congress, titled the Civil Honor Protection Act in Judicial Spaces, drafted from Laura Monroe's original documentation, supported by 62 bipartisan representatives. When the act was passed, Laura didn't stand at the podium of honor. She stood backstage, where she always believed truth lives. Next to her was her sister, who had once held the clippers to shave off what Danny had left behind. Now, Laura's hair had grown back, white, tightly curled, proud. A reporter asked, "Do you think you've won?" She said, "There's no winning or losing, only awakening, and a society that's just now opened its eyes." That night, Laura returned home. She sat in her armchair by the window, looking out onto the street. No sirens, no protests, just peace. Her nephew ran in, placing a newspaper on the table. "Auntie, they wrote about you. The woman who made justice look in the mirror." Laura laughed. "Good job, but next time, help Auntie spell check." "Why?" "Because next time, you might be the one writing the next chapter." And as the lights in the house slowly dimmed, one story came to a close, but a new generation had already been awakened. Justice is not a locked door. It is a hand always ready to turn the latch, so long as someone dares to twist. Laura Monroe.